As the aviation industry in the 1950s and 60s embraced supersonic speeds, defined avionics theory, and toyed with eccentric airframe designs, the A-7 Corsair II stood out as a peculiarly fascinating story. The Corsair II was a unique-looking warplane that lacked the supersonic capabilities of many aircraft of its time, but whose reliability and versatility allowed it to stay in service even when its flashier counterparts were being replaced by more ambitious proposals, and it quickly became a crucial asset for the U.S. Navy. Developed for the Vietnam War, the Corsair II proved to be a trusty and devastating strike aircraft that traded over-the-top features for a formidable range, increased payload capacity, and an affordable price. With its iconic oversized air intake and unique airframe, the warplane would be nicknamed the Slough, or Short Little Ugly F***, by the Navy crews. Still, there was nothing ugly about its performance. As early as the 1940s, the American combat aviation industry underwent a drastic and hectic series of shifts and evolutions that resulted in the turbulent and breakneck development of dozens of fascinating warplanes, each more ambitious than the last. The concept of avionics was just being defined, and aircraft manufacturers focused on incorporating supersonic technology in most of their newest designs. The bold proposals resulted in unique and innovative airframes that often suffered from short operational life. By the time they were deployed, a new and improved warplane was already coming out of the aircraft factory. Incorporating new technologies and daring airframe designs meant the projects were expensive to research, develop, and manufacture, which became an incredibly cumbersome problem considering the warplanes were swiftly replaced. Then, as the U.S. fully entered the Vietnam War, its leading seaborne aircraft was the A-4 Skyhawk, an agile and reliable vehicle that was reaching the end of its operational life. The Vought Corporation was eager to develop a replacement, as its short-range and light payload capabilities were rendered obsolete for modern warfare scenarios. The ever-evolving philosophy of the time led Vought to create formidable and ambitious designs like the tailless F-7U Cutlass or the influential supersonic F-8U Crusader, which stood out as a remarkable weapons platform. Still, as impressive as the Crusader was, it was an expensive warplane that continued using guns as its primary weapon, rendering it ineffective as a strike aircraft in the Vietnam conflict. The U.S. Navy needed an affordable and reliable strike warplane that put aside all the bells and whistles driving development costs through the roof and centered on an outstanding operational range and superb strike performance. To reduce costs even further, the new aircraft had to use the airframe of an already existing warplane, and Vought believed the Crusader was the perfect starting base for such a design. By the 1960s, the U.S. Navy had understood that despite its incredible advantages, supersonic speed was of little use to low-altitude strike aircraft, only shooting up the development and maintenance costs. A sea-based Air Strike Forces study group meticulously analyzed a total of 144 hypothetical aircraft to support the findings. The result was an unexpected deviation from the current aircraft development philosophy. Subsonic light strike aircraft could achieve superior performance to a supersonic one. The study concluded that the airframe could be smaller, cheaper, and easier to manufacture by preceding supersonic capability. Consequently, in what might have seemed like an odd step backward to the average onlooker, the Navy requisitioned a subsonic aircraft. Instead of speed, they wanted range and the ability to carry a much larger payload. The request was not insignificant. The Navy wanted a strike plane that had at least 2 times the range of the old Skyhawk and twice the payload capacity, while remaining cheap to produce and upkeep. The new project's goal was to create a warplane specialized in low-altitude dive attacks, while shortening the development time as much as possible by using an already trusted airframe as its starting point. Vought aviation engineer Russell Clark embraced the unique challenge and immediately assembled a team to take the reliable F-8U Crusader and transform it into a long-range, low-altitude strike aircraft. As an aircraft-launched plane, the new Corsair would have to remain compact and sturdy, with the ability to land and take off from limited spaces. Also, the aircraft had to be able to be produced in mass numbers, in contrast to many other flashier supersonic warplanes. From its earliest tests, the Corsair II exceeded all expectations. With 8,800 miles of range, it had 4 times the operational range of the Skyhawk, a much larger capacity for payload that exceeded 20,000 pounds, and an increased top ceiling. Impressively, it was also slightly faster than its predecessor. The original versions of the Corsair II were equipped with a single Pratt & Whitney TF30 P6 turbofan engine that replaced the afterburner-equipped J57 P20A turbojet engine of the F-8. As the new light attack aircraft began to be produced massively, the engine manufacturer had problems meeting the military and civilian demand for that specific model. As such, later iterations were equipped with other engines. The Corsair II was eventually powered by the Pratt & Whitney TF38 and the Allison TF41A2 engines, as well as a licensed model of the Rolls-Royce Spey engine. Air was fed to the engine by a simple large nose inlet, which gave the aircraft its peculiar appearance. It also posed a significant hazard to flight deck personnel, who had to develop specialized protocols to maintain the plane. Meanwhile, an aerial refueling system was mounted on the right-hand side of the nose, which allowed for mid-air refueling, boosting even further the already impressive range of the Corsair II. 2 cannons were mounted on the underside of the nose, and a mounting for AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles on either side of the fuselage was used for self-defense against aerial threats. Later variations had the 2 cannons replaced with a single M61A1 Vulcan rotary cannon. To reduce susceptibility to ground fire, the flying control hydraulic systems were triplicated. Other systems improved, and much of the fuselage had reinforced armor protection. The Corsair was often armed with the remarkable AGM-62 Walleye television-guided glide bomb, and this unique fire-and-forget bomb would be aimed using a video screen inside the cockpit. As the pilot acquired a target on the screen, he would lock the target and fire. After that, the pilot could flee the scene as the bomb smartly glided to the targeted location. The A-7 was fitted with an AN/APQ-116 radar, later followed by the AN/APQ-126, which was integrated into the LIAAS digital navigation system. The radar also fed an IBM navigation and weapons delivery computer, which allowed for accurate delivery of bombs from a more considerable standoff distance. All in all, the Corsair had an outstanding avionics system that surpassed most aircraft of its time. Furthermore, it was the first U.S. aircraft to have a modern heads-up display, which exhibited vital information such as dive angle, airspeed, altitude, drift, and targeting reticle. The technology quickly became a must-have instrument in every U.S. combat aircraft. The A-7 Corsair II flew its first combat missions over Vietnam in May of 1970 and was part of the Navy's offensive firepower during the Operation Linebacker strikes and the aerial mining of North Vietnamese ports in 1972. Pilots immediately fell in love with the new platform, considering it a responsive and easy-to-fly warplane that excelled at low-altitude strikes and had an incredible range. David "Frosty" Olson, who accumulated more than 3,500 hours flying the Corsair A-7A, B, C, E, and H, as well as performing 750 carrier landings, gave a more detailed description of the platform's highs and lows. Quote, "As an attack aircraft, it was a very stable platform, and it handled nicely, but it bled off energy fairly quickly, and without an afterburner, during air combat maneuvers, we would end up dropping from the sky like a turd from a tall moose, just to keep us at the corner velocity. Still, in the right hands, an A-7 could do a tolerable job, but it wasn't a fighter aircraft, although its fuel capacity also made it an airborne tanker." A total of 1,500 warplanes were built, and the Corsair II became the backbone of aerial carrier-launched operations during the conflict, with up to 854 models participating in over 97,000 sorties. Most of the missions carried out by the A-7 would continue to be low-altitude dive strikes that stood out for their reliability and bullseye accuracy. Ultimately, the Corsair II only lost 54 units throughout its combat service in the Vietnam War. And despite fears that its lack of supersonic speeds would make it a prime target for enemy fighters after a dive attack, the A-7 continued to serve decades after its initial debut, and several different iterations were developed. In total, the warplane has flown over 120,000 combat sorties and has fought extraordinarily well in conflicts in Vietnam, Libya, Grenada, Panama, and Operation Desert Storm. In an age of ambitious, over-the-top aircraft design, the Corsair II proved that sometimes the best aircraft was not the fastest or the most expensive, but the one you could build in large numbers and keep the pilots safe. During World War II, the German military created an aircraft unlike anything seen before, the Messerschmitt Me 323 Gigant, Giant. It was the largest land-based transport aircraft of the entire war. The impressive cargo carrier boasted 6 engines with counter-rotating propellers and a wingspan of over 180 feet. It could airlift 130 troops, or over 25,000 pounds of payload, including tanks. The Me 323 primarily served the Deutsches Afrika Korps and the German Eastern Front, until each and every last one of them fell to enemy fire. Today, only one complete wreck exists, but it is in a place few can reach. While preparing for the proposed invasion of the United Kingdom, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, German military planners believed that they needed a large assault glider to ferry troops and supplies across the English Channel. Although the existing German DFS-230 glider had been useful for the Battle of Fort Avon-Amyle in Belgium, it was considered too light and small to play a role in the desired attack on the British Isles. The design could only accommodate 2,600 pounds of cargo. To launch the invasion from France across the English Channel, the Third Reich needed aircraft that could carry vehicles and heavy equipment onto the British coast. Due to the extensive damage that the German Navy received during the invasion of Norway and the loss of aircraft during the Battle of Britain, Operation Sea Lion was postponed in September of 1940. However, the Germans were almost entirely settled on invading the Soviet Union by then, with plans for Operation Barbarossa being drawn. Therefore, the need for heavy transport aircraft remained. On October 18th, the German military ordered the Junkers and Messerschmitt companies to submit their respective proposals for an enormous transport glider within 14 days. Aside from the transport role, the aircraft also needed to be assault-ready. The Germans expected this new vehicle to be able to carry 88mm guns and their half-tractor or a Panzerkampfwagen 4 medium tank. Junkers created the Ju-322 Mammut, which was developed all the way to the prototype phase. That aircraft project was cancelled because it was made entirely of wood and used high-grade timber that was difficult to obtain. The prototype had a single flight, where it underperformed and revealed it was too unstable. Messerschmitt proposed a more capable aircraft that designers initially designated Me-261W. During development, it was eventually renamed the Messerschmitt Me 321. The massive glider would be used for transport in Africa and along the Eastern Front, but it would never be used as an assault craft. 200 airframes were built, but the unpowered design proved insanely impractical. To fly, the Me 321 had to be towed by 3 Bf-110 twin-engine fighters, and even then, still needed to be assisted by rocket boosters for takeoff. The flight configuration was incredibly dangerous and resulted in the worst aviation disaster in history at the time. The design patterns for the Me 323 were rooted in its predecessor glider, the Me 321. One of the recognizable features that carried over was the installation of 6 engines, based on the experience of the Bf-110 low planes. 3 of these went under each wing. An important decision during the development of the plane was the focus on limiting dependency on the strained German military industry. Since German factories were already busy with piling engine orders for bombers and fighters, the engines for the Me 323 were sourced from France. By then, the French were under German governance, so the aircraft were fitted with Gnome-Rhone radial engines. The first Me 323 aircraft were slow and not as responsive as intended. Work had to be carried out on the wheeled landing system and on the defensive armament without significantly affecting the fuselage. The original Me 321 glider design had only incorporated a disposable undercarriage that dropped off the plane as it climbed airborne. Once completed, the Messerschmitt 323 could be compared to a flying whale. It could carry 100 soldiers inside, or a tank, or a giant caliber cannon, or even medical patients with staff and machinery. The payload could go up to 12 tons. However, carrying this maximum weight required the use of the Walter HWK 109-500 for Starthilfe rocket-assisted takeoff. The fuselage was held up by steel tubes while the wings were made of fabric-lined wood. The wood was used to reduce the overall weight. The aircraft counted on multiple 7.92mm caliber guns or 13mm MG-131 machine guns, depending on the model. Despite this defensive armament, the plane was not agile at all and was therefore vulnerable to enemy attacks. Throughout production, several different models were developed. After the initial Me 323D1, an E1 version was introduced with 2 HDL-151 turrets with powerful 20mm cannons on the upper wing surfaces. Subsequent designs saw improvements to aerodynamics and a change to Junkers Jumo 21-1R engines. No official production count for the Me-323s exists, with sources contradicting each other, mostly because several Me-321 gliders were refitted into powered Me-323s. Estimates range from around 198 to 210 aircraft. The most astonishing fact, however, is that none of these planes survived World War II. The Messerschmitt 321 and now the Me-323 gave Germany the feeling that they could command the skies forever. While this was not true, the largest land-based transport aircraft ever made did provide them with exceptional service during the war. The two main fronts where it was used were the Soviet Union and Tunisia. The battlefront in North Africa seemed ever-changing, with Axis forces and Commonwealth armies constantly flipping in victories. The German supply lines went from Italy to Malta and ended in Tunisia. This route was particularly challenging because Malta was still a British colony and served as a takeoff point for attacks on German air or water convoys. In response, the Luftwaffe regularly bombed Malta, but the resilient territory never fell to Germany. As Germany's efforts in North Africa began to fall apart, Me-323s were sent in swarms with manpower and munitions from Sicily. Their introduction to the Tunisian campaign started in September of 1942, and their role in the Mediterranean theater followed in November. The Deutsches Afrika Korps came to rely on the equipment delivered by the Me-323s since Axis ships kept falling to Allied attacks. Adolf Hitler insisted on reinforcing and supporting his African army despite clear signs that the Tunisia campaign would mark an Allied victory. Unfortunately for the Germans, the glacial speed of the Me-323 led them to the same bitter fate of their Me-321 gliders. British fighters took them down like flies, even when the Me-323s were protected by escorts. The massive size of the aircraft led to its eventual downfall, as it impeded pilots from carrying out maneuvers to avoid enemy fire. Although the large wood and steel combination made for a sturdy body that could withstand considerable enemy fire, the long travel times meant that the aircraft was exposed for too long. The aircraft machine guns and cannons were effective countermeasures to a certain degree. They were limited to short range, and aiming was not always the easiest thing to do. The Mediterranean Sea absorbed many of the humongous German transport planes that tried to cross it. Even though vessels had proven to be too vulnerable to British and Allied fire, the Me-323 proved to be even more at risk of defeat from air-to-air fire. Estimates point out that around 15,000 metric tons of military equipment were delivered to Tunis and the Bizerta port between the end of 1942 and April of 1943, with approximately 1,200 trips from Italy to Tunisia. Some of the machinery delivered included over 300 trucks, more than 200 medium-sized guns, over 300 light guns, and around 100 ground combat vehicles. The Holy Thursday massacre came soon after the Palm Sunday massacre, where the Axis powers lost between 123 and 157 Junkers Ju-52s. The sequence of events marked a significant loss of Messerschmitt Me-323s on April 22, 1943. A fleet of 27 of these land-based transport planes were successfully intercepted by Allied fighter planes. The German Air Force was trying to resupply the Tunisia effort by sending fuel-loaded transports in a few fighter planes across the Mediterranean. The formation of Me-323s was in the company of Ju-52s and some other aircraft, but halfway through the journey from Sicily, the Me-323s set a course for Cape Bon, against the original orders they received. To this day, it's unknown why exactly the group leader opted for the change in route. The majority of the escorting fighting aircraft remained by the side of the Ju-52s. Rather than the initial 104 protectors, the large group of Me-323s was left with only 36 fighter companions. Despite those 36 protectors, the choice to separate from the central air convoy made the transport planes easy targets. When they learned of the incoming enemy, the South African Air Force sent 38 P-40 Warhawk fighters along with the Spitfire squadron. Some British and Polish Spitfires also joined the chase. The opposing aircraft met over the Gulf of Tunis, and the Allied fighters almost wholly obliterated the German transport aircraft. 22 Messerschmitt Me-323s fell into the Mediterranean Sea. Most of the Me-232 fleet on that front was gone in a matter of hours. These losses were even more significant when paired with the constant downing of Me-323s. Ultimately, the Luftwaffe withdrew the Messerschmitt Me-323 aircraft from the North African front and redirected them towards the Soviet Union. Although this was considered a prudent strategic move, considering that Northern Africa would soon entirely be claimed by the Allies, it was perhaps done too late and with much of their aircraft force depleted. By the end of the war, not a single one of these planes survived. The Luftwaffenmuseum der Bundeswehr hosts only a wing spar from one of them in its permanent collection. The most complete wreck known to exist was found in 2012 in the Mediterranean Sea by La Maddalena. The rusting giant had been downed by a British Brau fighter in July of 1943 while on its way to Pistoia. Now covered in algae and coral, the last Messerschmitt Me 323 is decaying slowly underwater. In the 1960s, a tailless double delta-wing aircraft was more of an unproven technology than an audacious undertaking. But although the design lacked historical knowledge, the ambitious Swedish engineers at Saab pursued it with determination. Unsurprisingly, when the J-35 model was finalized, the airframe encountered numerous problems during its initial service life. Due to its unstable nature, the double delta configuration made it difficult to land, requiring manual stabilization during such attempts. Little did the Swedish know that the challenge would provide a one-of-a-kind opportunity to discover a maneuver not yet known to any other nation, the Cobra. As the test pilots entered an uncontrollable stall at high alpha, they unexpectedly learned how to control it by quickly negating the angle of attack to counter the suspension. The maneuver turned the airframe into its own air brake, reducing its speed instantaneously. Out of nowhere, the Saab 35 became an indisputable icon. After World War II, the development of jet fighter technology advanced significantly, and Sweden would not stay behind. The country foresaw the need for a supersonic fighter capable of intercepting bombers at high altitudes while also being able to engage others. In the fall of 1948, the Swedish Air Force, through the Defense Materiel Administration, announced a freshly formulated set of requirements for a leading-edge interceptor. Notably, the aircraft was required to attack hostile bombers in the transonic speed range. As such, the original requirement specified a top speed of no less than Mach 1.4. In 1956, the top speed requirement was revised to Mach 1.7, and 3 years later, it was raised to Mach 2. Additionally, the cockpit was required to accommodate a single pilot and enable combat operations in all weather conditions, both day and night. Moreover, it was required to operate out of austere airstrips while loaded with all the necessary equipment to neutralize modern jet bomber aircraft. Furthermore, the aircraft had to be simple enough for conscripts with minimal training to refuel and rearm the aircraft within 10 minutes. Unlike the contemporary U.S. Air Force F-104 starfighters, which were conceived at the same time, the Nordic creation had to fulfill a role unique to Sweden, operating from reinforced public roads. During the Cold War, the Swedish defense developed a system to use public roads as part of wartime airbases to protect against potential nuclear threats, and Saab was up to the task. Meeting all the criteria for the advanced interceptor aircraft was a challenging task for the engineers and designers. As preliminary studies revealed, the use of a delta wing configuration could address most of the critical issues. The delta wing, with its triangular shape, offered several advantages over conventional wings, providing more internal volume for fuel storage and often being structurally robust. However, they tended to experience higher drag, and the unconventional aircraft called for an unconventional proposal. Nevertheless, to achieve the most optimized aerodynamics, the forward fuselage had to be extended, which resulted in an excessively heavy aircraft. Consequently, the innovative designers opted for a unique, or rather radical, approach, a double delta wing. As promising as the double delta wing seemed, the configuration was completely untested, and in an era before the advent of computer-aided testing and flight simulation, the engineers faced a slow and laborious undertaking. The optimum solution demanded extensive wind tunnel testing to explore the configuration's uncertain behavior. Although mock-ups were useful for proof of concept, only live flight tests could provide valuable insights. As a result, the entire staff of more than 500 technicians, led by aviation engineer Eric Bratt, built a small but flyable test aircraft, the subscale Saab 210. The Little Draken, or Little Dragon, flew for the first time over Stockholm in January of 1952, performing splendidly. The subsequent results supported the order for 3 full-size prototypes, and 3 years later, the first full-size Draken conducted its maiden flight. With the exception of an afterburner, the first prototype successfully completed its first flight. However, as Flight International recounted, an unusually intensive flight test program was required to fully define the aircraft's exceptional speed, range, and complex systems. On the other hand, the second prototype, equipped with an afterburner, unintentionally broke the sound barrier while climbing on its very first flight. The double delta configuration was not only functional, but it proved to be exceptional. Back in the 1960s, Swedish Saab pilots discovered the Kortparad, or Cobra maneuver, a controlled superstall state. The technically challenging display involved rapidly lifting the nose, causing the aircraft to fly forward, perpendicular to the ground. Then, facing the sky, the pilot would turn the airframe into an enormous air brake to slow down the vehicle as quickly as possible. While not directly applicable to combat scenarios, the maneuver demonstrated the Saab 35's tremendous maneuverability. In fact, the Saab 35 was twice as capable as other single-engine jets of its era, making it possible to dispense with a tailplane altogether. The result was a sleek but straightforward profile. As distinctive as the double delta wing was, however, the circular fuselage was almost indistinguishable from its surface, anticipating what would be known as the blended wing body. On the other hand, the inboard portion of the wing was a large chord surface extending almost to the engine intakes. For high-speed performance, the leading edge of the inner wing had an 80-degree sweep, while the outer wing was angled at 60 degrees for lower speeds. Overall, the double delta proved to be extremely capable. Deliveries of Draken's first iteration began in late 1959. As reported by Flight International, the introduction of the J-35A to service was not only smooth, but the scramble and turnaround times were actually, quote, most satisfactory. The first Swedish Air Force wing to receive the type was F-13, stationed at Norrköping, but by the end of 1960, multiple wings were already equipped with the Draken and had achieved operational status. Although the J-35 Draken was primarily designed as a high-altitude interceptor and not a dogfighter, it proved to be more than capable in both roles, with good quick-turn capability and high speed at all altitudes. Early models were intended solely for air defense, but an improved one was later developed, the J-35B. This model featured an enhanced power plant, the license-built Rolls-Royce Avon 200-300 engine, or Svenska Flygmotor RM6BC, an enlarged afterburner, and a redesigned rear fuselage. It also had a new Saab-built S-7 collision course gun sight and fire control radar, as well as integration with the Air Defense Control Network Strill 60. No less than 651 Dragons were manufactured, with the Swedish fleet incorporating 6 different versions. Eventually, 2 additional models were offered for export, primarily to Denmark and Finland. Those variants were equipped with a Ferranti-built Airpass 2 fire control radar, which was effective in acquiring various air-to-air or air-to-surface targets. Moreover, the ground mapping mode would work in conjunction with the navigation systems. Notably, the Saab 35 was just as successful outside of Sweden as it was inside it. The United States would employ a dozen formerly Danish Dragons as trainers, and Austria purchased several dozen specially refurbished J-35Ds, equipping them with internal cannons instead of air-to-air missiles, as the Austrian state treaty restricted the use of such missiles. For the most part, the cockpit of the Draken featured Swedish-sourced instrumentation, with newer models introducing several advancements, such as a revised canopy and more modern avionics, including a 3-axis autopilot. A typical layout included 2 separate radio units, a high-speed data link, and 2 navigation systems. However, as the stick lacked a natural feedback system, a Q-feel system generated artificial forces. The fuselage consisted of a front and rear section bolted together. The forward section, integrated with the intake ducts and wing, accommodated the fire control radar, cockpit, nose undercarriage, integral fuel tanks, and other systems. Likewise, the rear portion, manufactured as a single piece with the inner wing, contained the power plant and afterburner, bag-type fuel tanks, main landing gear, drogue parachute, and armament. The Draken's main armament was carried externally, with up to 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles hung on hardpoints beneath the wings and fuselage. Alternative payloads included a variety of bombs and rockets, and also provisions for installing a pair of 30mm cannons, housed within each inboard wing panel, or additional fuel tanks could take up the same space. In a reconnaissance mode, the J-35 could instead be fitted with various camera pods underneath the fuselage. Over the years, the design saw several upgrades, with the last being the J-35J, produced during the late 1980s. However, the Draken had already been replaced by the Saab 37 Gigant at that point, and it was irremediably phased out by 1999. The Draken left a remarkable legacy with its double delta configuration, which became increasingly popular at Saab. The aircraft remained in use in some capacity until the mid-2000s, through a service life extension program, ending its service life after roughly 5 decades. a long-lived run for a supposedly experimental aircraft. Throughout World War II, the Royal Air Force successfully developed many fighter aircraft to confront the feared Luftwaffe. Still, several fighters were largely forgotten and eclipsed by the powerful German warplanes, and the Westland Whirlwind was one of them. A highly capable twin-engine heavy fighter, the Whirlwind was one of the fastest combat aircraft when it first took to the skies, as well as the world's most heavily armed fighter. With 4 Hispano-Suiza HS-404 20mm autocannons mounted on its nose, the type was explicitly made to fire hundreds of rounds per second. The Whirlwind consistently served over the English Channel as the Battle of Britain approached, and was expected to destroy anything that came in its path. That is, until its own engines got in the way. As the prospect of war with Germany became more likely in the 1930s, the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force evaluated its current aircraft's shortcomings. While the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire fighters were extremely advanced designs for their time, both warplanes had a short range and were only armed with Browning machine guns. It was thus believed that a longer-range heavy fighter armed with cannons would be needed to destroy the German bombers and to escort British bombers on raids deep into enemy territory. By then, several aircraft designers around the world also perceived that increased attack top speeds were imposing shorter firing times on fighter pilots, translating into less ammunition hitting the target. After a thorough study, the British Air Ministry decided that instead of the more common setup, consisting of 2 rifle-caliber machine guns, a fighter with up to 8 would deliver 256 rounds per second. As such, the Air Ministry issued an operational requirement in 1935 calling for a single-seat day and night heavy fighter armed with 4 cannons. Also, the new aircraft's top speed had to be at least 330 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, which was at least 40 miles per hour higher than all other contemporary bombers. After receiving proposals from several British aircraft manufacturers, the Air Ministry took 2 years for evaluations until the submission from Westland Aircraft was selected. The design team had just undergone a restructuring and was led by William Edward Willoughby Teddy Petter. The new company leading engineer was a former student of aerodynamics at Cambridge University and had an innate understanding of how air flowed around aircraft, thus designing an aircraft that employed state-of-the-art technology and ultimately convincing the demanding Air Ministry. The Westland Whirlwind fighter was a highly innovative design for its time. With a set of 2 Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines mounted in pods underneath the low wings, the motor was a proven and reliable model, also used in interwar British aircraft such as the Hawker Fury biplane fighter. The Whirlwind was also the first British fighter with a bubble canopy, providing excellent vision. The initial prototype was made of all metal with a magnesium skin on the fuselage's rear and made its maiden flight in October of 1938, just as the war loomed closer. The initial flight tests were so promising that the Air Ministry almost ordered the aircraft into immediate production. However, the Westland engineers decided that the Kestrel engine should be replaced with a newly developed, upgraded and supercharged Rolls-Royce engine, the Peregrine. Westland was aiming for improved all-around performance by producing over 850 horsepower compared to the 650 of the Kestrel. The engines were cooled by ducted radiators fitted in the inner section of the wing to reduce drag. These also provided cockpit heat, something that was lacking in many other Royal Air Force models of the period. By early 1939, the Whirlwind program was finally at a point in which the Air Ministry could place large-scale orders. As such, the office ordered 200 aircraft as a first batch and 200 more as a second. On paper, the aircraft came from a record-breaking and incredibly unique design, and the Royal Air Force officials hoped that its new warplane would be decisive in changing the tide of the war. Consequently, the model was kept under wraps from the general public until 1942. The first production Whirlwind flew its maiden flight in June of 1940, and deliveries began the following month. The Royal Air Force 263rd Squadron, still reforming at the Grangemouth Air Base in Scotland after suffering devastating losses in the Norwegian campaign, was the first to receive the model on July 6th. Despite an urgent need for fighters during the Battle of Britain during the summer and autumn of 1940, The 263rd Squadron remained in Scotland, as deliveries of the Westland Whirlwind fighters were rolling out slower than initially planned. The aircraft were declared fully operational on December 7, 1940, and initial operations consisted of convoy patrols and hunting and destroying German E-boats in the English Channel. From early 1941, the 263rd Squadron had considerable success flying the Whirlwind against the feared German Air Force Junkers Ju-88s, Dornier Do-217s, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. The first air-to-air fatal hit credited to a Westland Whirlwind occurred on February 8, 1941, when a pilot of the 263rd Squadron shot down an Arado AR-196 floatplane. At the time of its introduction, the model's 4 Hispano Mark I 20mm cannon armament, capable of delivering a weight of fire of up to 600 pounds of explosive shells per minute, was the most powerful armament of any aircraft in the world. These cannons were increasingly used in their ground attack and bomber escort roles throughout the next 2 years. However, they were prone to jamming, and the metal often caused bruises on the pilot's hands while shooting. With a maximum speed of 360 miles per hour, similar to early versions of the Spitfire fighter, the Whirlwind also had an operational range of almost twice that of its contemporaries. And while its overall performance was reasonable, many Royal Air Force pilots noted that its maneuverability fell short of initial expectations. However, the aircraft had an even more crucial issue. Its engines were both underpowered and unreliable. The record-breaking Rolls-Royce Merlin was the main engine used by the Royal Air Force throughout most of World War II, but the Whirlwind used the far inferior Rolls-Royce Peregrine, machines that consumed 3 times the aircraft alloy as the prized Spitfire. As France fell to the Germans, the British government scrambled to prepare for the seemingly inevitable Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, and the War Cabinet ordered that all resources be directed for the nation's defense. Thus, attention inevitably switched to building as many Spitfire and Hurricane fighter aircraft as possible. To streamline production, the Rolls-Royce company decided to focus on producing the Merlin engine used in both fighters, practically halting the entire development of the Peregrine motor. While some officials discussed the possibility of continuing production of the Whirlwind by replacing the Peregrine with the Merlin engine, the action would have required a significant and costly redesign, as the latter was both larger and heavier. With all resources focused on the Merlin, the Peregrine was only produced 301 times, and this lack of engines also halted the production of the Whirlwind. The last of only 116 Whirlwinds was delivered to the Royal Air Force in January of 1942. Even though fewer Whirlwinds than initially expected were ultimately produced, those in service still had a long way to go. With the performance of the Peregrine engines lacking at high altitudes, the Whirlwind was relegated to mostly performing ground attack missions over France. 67 models were eventually converted to a fighter-bomber configuration with underwing racks capable of carrying 2 500-pound bombs. These modified Whirlwinds, nicknamed Whirly Bombers, blasted hundreds of locomotives, bridges, shipping, and other targets all over northern France. In September of 1941, the 137th Squadron, a unit specialized in attacks against railway targets, received its first Westland Whirlwind. However, as 1943 approached, new cannon fighters like the Typhoon were available for ground attack duties, leading to the withdrawal of the Whirlwind after a very short wartime service life. The final flight of a Westland Whirlwind was recorded in June of 1943, after an attack by the 263rd Squadron on a German airfield at Poix, France. Then, the following January, the type was officially declared obsolete by the Royal Air Force. While the Westland Whirlwind was a capable fighter and ground attack aircraft, its development was hampered by an unreliable and later unavailable engine. Despite its shortcomings, the Whirlwind was well liked by most pilots. According to Sergeant G.L. Buckwell of the 263rd Squadron, who was shot down while flying a mission in France, the type was, quote, "great to fly. We were a privileged few." In retrospect, the lesson of the Whirlwind is clear. A radical aircraft requires either prolonged development or widespread service to exploit its concept and eliminate its weaknesses. Too often in World War II, Such aircraft suffered accelerated development or limited service, with the result that teething difficulties came to be regarded as permanent limitations. The last airworthy Whirlwind was retained by the Westland Company as an executive transport, and was scrapped in 1947. In the end, its limited production ensured that this long-forgotten aircraft never received the recognition given to other Royal Air Force fighters of the era. During World War II, the race for being the most technologically innovative country was more important than ever, particularly in aviation. As entirely new air forces were built from the ground up, almost 1 million aircraft were produced worldwide for warfare. And even though the United States joined the war later than most of the other technologically advanced countries, they didn't want to be left behind. To keep up with wild new technologies such as jet power and flying wings, they wanted to design something that had never been seen before. The XP-79 was, at a time, thought to be the answer. The XP-79 was the first jet-powered aircraft of the United States. Its purpose was to attack enemy bombers at unusually high speeds by ramming into them without suffering any damage itself. Its unique shape and strong magnesium-covered armor would allow it to slice off the tails and wings from enemy aircraft. It was nicknamed the Flying Chainsaw. In the late stages of World War II, just as the odds were starting to favor the Allied forces, American bomber formations in Europe were frequently attacked by a new German rocket-powered jet, the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet. And even though these small jets brought plenty of show and theatrics to aerial combat, they weren't very effective. Still, the American public marveled at the design and technology of these inventions and wondered when they would get a small fighter jet of their own. What they didn't know was that the U.S. Army Air Forces was already working with Northrop Corporation on a project of just that magnitude. The Northrop XP-79 was the brainchild of this ambitious project. Jack Northrop, who was one of America's most innovative aircraft designers, intended for it to ram into enemy bombers and split them open. To achieve this, the pilot had to lie down in a prone position, similar to that of a glider. Because of this, it was known as the Flying Chainsaw. Jack Northrop was always interested in aviation, beginning with his first job in the field at age 21 as a draftsman for Lockheed Aircraft Manufacturing Company. He was also one of the leading designers of the Douglas round-the-world cruiser in 1923 when he worked at the Douglas Aircraft Company. In 1927, he rejoined the Lockheed brothers, who by then had changed their company name to Lockheed Aircraft Company, where he collaborated as chief engineer on the Lockheed Vega, a civilian transport monoplane with unusually high performance for that time. It was internationally known and was used by top pilots such as Amelia Earhart, Wiley Post, and Hubert Wilkins. At age 34, Northrop ventured out on his own and founded the Avion Company. He later sold to the United Aircraft and Transport Corporation in 1930 and renamed the company to Northrop Aircraft Corporation. Northrop founded Northrop Co. in 1932 as a subsidiary of Douglas, his previous employer. There, he worked as chief engineer, and he helped design the A-17 attack plane for the Air Corps, as well as the BT-1 bomber for the Navy during the Great Depression. He then formed Northrop Aircraft Incorporated in 1939, when World War II had just begun, and built the first successful N-1M flying wing and the XP-56 flying wing fighter. He also engineered the JB-10 flying bomb, the P-61 Black Widow night fighter, and the XP-79 flying wing fighter. Northrop designed numerous and advanced conventional aircraft, but his true passion was for flying wing designs. He believed that such a jet with a single airfoil surface would have the most effective lifting capabilities. The lack of a fuselage and tail unit would mean less drag to affect overall performance and lower production costs. In his mind, it was a win-win. In 1942, Jack Northrop proved himself to be well ahead of his fellow American competitors and previous employers when his flying wing concept took a dramatic step forward. He convinced the United States Army Air Forces that he could build a flying wing fighter jet that could fly faster than the speed of sound. The USAAF showed interest and offered him a contract for 2 prototypes. Northrop's program began in 1943 with the codename Project 12 as its aircraft designation. It would have to be developed with the utmost secrecy, as spying eyes could steal the advanced technology. Their plan was a rocket-powered flying wing designed with a total wingspan of only 32 feet. To fly it, the pilot would have to lie down in a prone position. This was believed to allow the pilot to tolerate more in the way of G-forces sustained during high-speed maneuvers. It would also be less likely to be spotted by enemy radars. Such a flight mission was not for the faint of heart. Experts believed that since the fighter's layout was so revolutionary and new, test glider prototypes had to be built to verify the validity of the concept. Northrop designated this part of the program NS-12. The Army Air Force gave the glider their own name, the MX-334. Perhaps confusingly, During the testing period, the later powered version would be named out of sequence and would be referred to as the MX-324. The powered MX-324 was first tested on October 2, 1943. It had a tricycle undercarriage, which ensured a level form when the aircraft was at rest. The power plants were designed to be placed deep into the fuselage aft. Its Aerojet rocket engines had been delayed in a problematic development cycle, which would later haunt the company's involvement in the program. Engineers at Aerojet rushed development to produce the XCal 200 rocket motor, which was fueled by monoethyl aniline and nitric acid. The rocket fuel burned quickly, and a flight time of just under 4 minutes was estimated. Although the performance wouldn't be enough for a production model, the rockets proved useful for testing purposes. The MX-324 flew under its own power on June 23, 1944, making it the United States' first rocket-powered aircraft. Adjacent to the MX-324's development was the Northrop XP-79. This model was of greater military value as it was designed to compete with the German Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet. Originally, just as with the MX-324, it was to be rocket-powered, and it also required a pilot lying prone in the cockpit. The XP-79 was to be able to reach speeds of 500 miles an hour, and the cabin would be pressurized to ensure the pilot's survival up to 40,000 feet in altitude. In contrast with authentic flying wings, the XP-79 design had a large swept-wing surface paired with vertical tail fins at the rear for extra stabilization and maneuverability. Aerojet was never able to overcome the limitations of the XCal 200 rocket tested with the MX-324. Instead, Westinghouse was chosen to deliver a pair of all-new turbojet engines. Each of these 19 Bs would generate 1,150 pounds of thrust. The cockpit was at the center of the triangle's apex and straddled on either side by twin intakes to aspirate the twin engines. The undercarriage had 4 landing gear legs in a quad arrangement instead of the more conventional 3-legged form. The Armed Forces' most fundamental requirement for this project was that the new flying wing would be able to ram into enemy bombers. The Germans had aircraft utilizing similar concepts already in battle. Even though these yielded mixed results, America wanted the tactic in their arsenal as well. It was an approach that, by modern standards, now sounds delusional. After the testing period finished, the XP-79 was supposed to fly out from nearby Allied airbases against incoming enemy bombers. It would launch quickly due to the use of jet fuel-assisted takeoffs, or JATO, and reach peak altitude in minutes. No armament was intended for this design. The XP-79's body would be covered in heavy-gauge magnesium armor plating to mitigate damage while ramming into enemy aircraft. The XP-79's pilot was expected to make high-speed passes through enemy formations, using the reinforced wing edges to slice through the frame of the enemy bombers. It would move so fast that enemy gunners wouldn't be able to target and fire, so the pilot would face little danger. Furthermore, the pilot would protect his head with bulletproof glass in the cockpit. However, by 1945, the XP-79 was being readied for a kind of battle that no longer existed. Fears of Hitler's bombers reached their greatest heights in the Battle of Britain, but further Luftwaffe bombing formations never materialized in the mid to late war years. As the prospect of facing off against wave after wave of German bombers subsided, the XP-79's mission profile became a moot point. The first flyable XP-79, the XP-79B, was painted white and was given the serial number 43-352437. It was trucked to the Muroc Dry Lake Testing Facility in preparation for its first flight. Its first ominous taxiing tests were conducted in June 1945, during which all of its tires burst on at least several occasions. The Flying Chainsaw later actually had only one flight test, which lasted less than half an hour and ended with disastrous consequences. On September 12, 1945, distinguished test pilot Harry Crosby got on the jet, lay down, and prepared to take it for its maiden flight. He immediately ran into setbacks before he even got off the ground. As Crosby accelerated down the runway, an Army fire truck drove directly into its path. He was able to chop the throttle and reapplied power once the truck was out of his way. Crosby reached 10,000 feet after takeoff, and for the next 15 minutes, he flew around the testing field, examining the XP-79's ability to turn. Suddenly, everything that could go wrong did, and in just one turn, the pilot and the flying ram went into a nose-down spin. He tried to regain control, but it was impossible. Crosby jumped out the plane's escape hatch, but he was struck by the wing, and he was unable to open his parachute. The XP-79 crashed into the desert floor and exploded in a white-hot flare, a color and flame that only magnesium creates. The Flying Chainsaw was no more. Northrop and his engineers determined that the XP-79's control problem could be fixed for the next test. Still, the U.S. Air Force didn't want to risk any further disasters, so they decided to abandon the project. World War II was over anyways, and more conventional jet designs were already entering production. The techniques used to create the XP-79, however, aided in the development of other future projects. Northrop's obsession with flying wing designs finally came true when he developed his B-35 and B-49 bombers. it didn't look like it should be able to fly. Despite Blohm & Voss being a famed ship and seaplane builder during World War II, it might be the creation of the BV-141 for which it's most remembered, despite only 20 in some form or another having actually been built. The German airframe was easily distinguished by its unique structural asymmetry, a single engine on the main body of the aircraft, with a pod containing the pilot, an observer, and a rear gunner mounted on the starboard side. The BV-141 was initially intended to be a reconnaissance plane, and sought to offer unparalleled visibility from the pod compared to other single-engine cockpits, where clear sightlines were greatly restricted. The Reichsluftwaffenministerium was reportedly aghast when the bizarre configuration was submitted as a proposal in a design contest. Yet the plane won over a number of fans, most notably Luftwaffe Colonel General Ernst Udet, after it satisfied nearly every mission requirement in testing. Hermann Göring, Luftwaffe's Supreme Commander, remained unconvinced. Competing against the BV-141 were the Focke-Wulf FW-189 Uhu and the Arado AR-198. Even though the contest design requirements demanded a single-engine aircraft proposal, both submitted twin-engine designs. Chief designer of the BV-141, Dr. Richard Vogt, refused to be moved, however, and pushed forward with an unusual prototype. The German Reichsluftwaffenministerium mandated a single-engine, three-seater aircraft for short-range reconnaissance and observation. They emphasized it'd have excellent visibility. In response, both Arado and Focke-Wulf submitted proposals. The head of Hamburger Flugzeugbau, Richard Vogt, pursued a novel approach with Blohm & Voss, Hamburger Flugzeugbau's parent company. At that time, the aircraft company was mostly known for its flying boats or float planes, which were used by the German Luftwaffe. Yet the Reichsluftwaffenministerium had all but promised Arado the contract for the airplane. They were developing the AR-198, favored by German officials at the time. Yet that aircraft turned out to be a disappointment and was subsequently abandoned. After Arado's attempt, Focke-Wulf earned the contract for its FW-189 Uhu. They failed to provide single engine because of the twin boom design, which required two small engines. Richard Vogt's proposal was a part of his passion project. However, the German government had not invited him or Blohm & Voss to participate. Nevertheless, he did not let that stop him. He delivered a unique asymmetrical design. His belief was that the only way to create the intended single-engine plane was to develop a light bomber with an asymmetrical configuration. Walter Blohm and his company long held the idea that military need for flying boats would give way to commercial business after the war. Seaplanes would eventually replace passenger ferries and boat lines to transport people across continents and countries. Following this line of thinking, Blohm & Voss always sought to keep their designs and developments considering possible commercial interest, despite their limited capacity. Previous World War I infantryman and aviator Richard Vogt designed his own aircraft for over 10 years before joining Blohm & Voss. Although his early designs didn't suffice, he did create a name for himself in the aviation industry. Those familiar described him as an ambitious and outspoken character who was focused and driven. With a unique vision for the future of aviation, he held his designs to higher standards than the industry. Rather than work on traditional aircraft, he wanted to innovate. As World War II began, aircraft production transitioned from wood and canvas biplanes to metal monoplanes. Design and development took a conventional approach to military and civilian planes. This model required a contoured fuselage that tapered at the rear, with an engine in front of the cockpit. Furthermore, almost all designs featured standardized straight-edge wings in the forward portion of the airframe, with vertical fins positioned at the tail. Few tried to innovate, yet engineers struggled with drawbacks to the conventional airframes. First, the cockpit's design left crews with poor visibility above and behind its wings and engine. Since the forward-mounted engine was almost always centralized, the propeller's air circulated motion in a way that aggressively hit rudders. This forced the planes to run counter to pilot controls. Not only that, but the conventional engine placement forced pilots to regularly counteract the unwanted friction. The plane's torque skewed flight to one side, caused by the conventional plane's powerful engine needed to rotate its large propeller. Although symmetrical airframes were the norm, the planes did not fly symmetrically. Therefore, Richard Vogt sought to find another type of design that could provide symmetric performance and handling. The Blohm+Voss BB-141 was a standout aircraft for its unique design. It used plexiglass glazed gondola starboard, which provided excellent visibility similar to that of the FW-189, but with even more glass paneling. This cockpit could carry a pilot, an observer, and a gunner to man rear artillery. The fuselage on the port side carried the BMW 132N radial engine and extended to the tail unit. At first look, the aircraft's weight distribution seemed like it would cause roll. However, weight was evenly supported by lift. The original design laid out a symmetrical tailplane, made asymmetrical for the 141B, with the starboard tailplane removed to improve the rear gunner's view for firing. The initial prototype, while novel, was still conventional compared to the final form. A pair of slim booms, one of them slightly offset towards the port side of the centerline, generated the power plant and tail unit. The other, offset towards starboard, had a plexiglass crew nacelle. This provided excellent visibility for the three-man crew. With two cylindrical structures attached to each other using a single long straight-edged wing design with clipped tips, the wings were mounted towards the front of the design in standard monoplane configuration. The tail unit, or empennage, was simply a rounded, highly swept tailplane and a horizontal tailplane towards the port side. This first design carried a conventional radial piston-powered three-blade propeller system, charged by a single BMW 801A engine with 1,560 horsepower, and a maximum speed of 272 miles per hour. This first prototype could fly up to 31,810 feet, with a range of 1,181 miles. Once the final design was set, the BB-141 featured its single-tail system with an asymmetrical arrangement. The plane distributed its weight and fixed the handling problems which plagued previous aircraft. Blohm+Voss contributed significantly to the development of float planes used by the German Air Force for strategic bombing during World War II. Yet their contribution to asymmetric design was also significant. The engineers developing the aircraft knew it would be one of the most unique planes of the World War II era. In line with the novel planes and military developments Germany produced, developers knew that keeping the engine in the nose without placing the cockpit above it would offer more efficient aerodynamics than conventionally arranged aircraft. Furthermore, this choice would prove an asymmetric airframe could maintain the same quality of performance and handling as symmetric models. Walter Blohm hoped that the BB-141 would bewilder the enemy due to its shape, and lead them to believe it was a fighter and not a bomber. From the start of development in 1938, his company found that a plane capable of going against the Hurricane Mk1 was needed. The intrepid Hurricane aircraft had been used previously by Allies on the Western Front and was still being used. Unfortunately, their passion project and excitement led to several errors being overlooked until prototypes were fully produced. The first major problem was that the rudder was under constant assault from drag. Another prominent issue was the cockpit placement. While novel and helpful for aerodynamics, it left crews vulnerable. The more extended wing was lengthened to maintain balance, needed for the additional weight of the machine guns and crew. Three prototypes were completed for testing, with an evaluation batch of 5 of version A. Production was reportedly backed by German pilot and Luftwaffe General Ernst Udet. Yet the Reichsluftfahrtministerium established on April 4, 1940, that while the plane mostly exceeded expectations, it still underperformed. Nevertheless, it showed promise as a reconnaissance plane. Therefore, in 1939, Germany ordered 500 BB-141s. Although the engineers and designers were somewhat disappointed that their intended bomber failed, they were grateful to receive a contract at all. By 1941, production was almost ready to enter full swing. Yet after 12 examples were shown, the German government decided that the unique design of the BB-141 couldn't be produced as efficiently as more conventional aircraft. Instead, they still relied on their significant stock of Focke-Wulf 189s, which performed well enough. The 12 confirmed production aircraft featured more powerful and impressive BMW 801 engines, which may have also played a role in the plane's cancellation, as these engines were still urgently needed for the FW fighter plane. The fate of the BB-141 was ultimately sealed after an Allied bombing raid destroyed the Focke-Wulf factory in Bremen. It was manufacturing the FW-200 Condor, an aircraft model used as one of Hitler's personal transport and envisioned as a heavy bomber supporting Germany's thrust into the Soviet Union. Blohm+Voss could do nothing, as much of their production capacity was taken over by the Condor. As the Allies took Germany, soldiers discovered the wreckage of several BB-141s. At least one was collected by British forces and sent back to England for examination. Record entries in the bibliography of scientific and industrial reports suggest that the US's Air Materiel Command may have gotten their hands on at least one other BB-141 for testing as well. Based on German records of production, a total of 20 BB-141Bs were produced, rather than the widely believed set of only 12. None of the aircraft or its 38 planned variants ever saw combat. Some were only ever piloted during testing between 1939 and 1940. The initial plan to send as many of them to the Eastern Front as possible for reconnaissance never materialized. Sadly, not a single Blohm+Voss BB-141 survives to this day. As the war in Europe concluded, Richard Vogt was brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, where his interest in unconventional aircraft designs continued. He reportedly worked on designs for nuclear-powered bombers, before joining Boeing as a civilian consultant. The Heinkel He-177 heavy bomber was doomed from the very start. Conceptual problems and incompatible design elements gave it a terrible reputation. It was often nicknamed the Luftwaffenfeuerzeug, or the Air Force lighter, for its constant engine fires. It was also nicknamed the Flying Coffin, the One-Way Bomber, and the Volcano, for the many accidents pilots had while flying it. During World War II, it only saw limited service with the Luftwaffe. Most of the crashes the He-177 suffered were caused by mechanical failures, not by enemy fire. Hitler despised it. Göring despised it. But some Luftwaffe pilots still pushed the project in hopes of deploying it as the dive bomber. The He-177 was Germany's only long-range heavy bomber produced in appreciable numbers. The 35-ton plane, however, would contribute to the German defeat by sucking up valuable resources into an ineffective and compromised project. Historians even say that all the effort spent trying to fix the aircraft may have doomed the Third Reich to lose the war in the air because of the enormous resources the project required. The course-setting bomb sight was the first practical system for adequately accounting for wind effects when dropping bombs. It proved useful in World War I's last stages, when aircraft became an integral part of all armed forces. However, when the bomb sight was used from high altitudes, its accuracy greatly diminished. The aircraft from the late 1930s were far more potent than its predecessors, with increased range, altitude, and overall performance. German bomb sight technology, in particular, was especially poor. During the Spanish Civil War, Hitler sent a small garrison of air units to lend a hand to Francisco Franco. This force was the famous Condor Legion. In the conflict, Germany experimented with various tactics that would later be used in World War II. One of those tactics was the precision dive bombing of the Junkers Ju-87 Stukas. The experience of the Condor Legion in Spain tended to support the idea that dive bombing was superior to bomb sight. Data gathered from veteran pilots of the Spanish Civil War demonstrated that diving on the target significantly increased the accuracy of the drop, allowing pinpoint attacks on small targets like bunkers, bridges, and ships. Germany's most famous pilot, Ernst Udet, one of the leading promoters of the Stuka and its dive bombing capabilities, pushed the idea of developing a new, bigger dive bomber. Many Luftwaffe pilots also believed that pinpoint accuracy was indeed possible for a heavy bomber. If an aircraft attacked a larger target, like a factory, the high-angle attacks of the Stuka would not be needed. A shallow-angle attack, known as glide bombing, would suffice. Improvements in glide bombing increased accuracy to the point that a single aircraft could knock out a factory. This was in stark contrast to Germany's deficient sight bombing, where a fleet of aircraft would need to drop a considerable number of bombs, hoping that at least some would hit their target. Udet and others in the Luftwaffe began to see the future bomber not as a strategic bomber that others argued for, but instead as essentially a long-range Stuka with more firepower. From all the data gathered, the Luftwaffe concluded that their new heavy bomber could successfully strike targets by diving and gliding. The opportunity to develop this unique type of aircraft came when strategic bomber proponent General Walter Weffer died in June 1936. Weffer had been an advocate of strategic bombing and pressed the Luftwaffe to develop a dedicated long-range bomber to attack the Soviet Union's factories in the Ural Mountains. The original concept for General Weffer's plane was called Bomber A. His long-range bomber was required to carry a bomb load of at least 1,000 kilograms over a range of 5,000 kilometers, with a maximum speed of no less than 500 kilometers per hour at altitude. In addition to outperforming by a considerable margin all other bombers then in service, the design's speed was intended to allow it to outrun any contemporary fighter. This was called the Schnellbomber concept. A mock-up aircraft was completed in November 1937, with the designation number B-177. The Luftwaffe High Command confirmed that the new design possessed sufficient structural strength to undertake medium-degree diving attacks. Heinkel, however, retorted that the aircraft would never be capable of successfully diving. He argued that it would be too heavy and oversized as a bomber, making it unable to pull off a proper near-vertical dive without plunging into the ground. The HE-177 could do a shallower dive at most, or glide, but not very well. Still, forced by the new directive, engineers modified the design for glide bombing. The priority was to strengthen the aircraft further to allow it to safely pull out of dives. If the plane was not properly reinforced, there was a risk that it could break up during descent. Upon completion, the Heinkel HE-177 was classified as a heavy bomber. Its promised performance was better than any bomber globally, carrying 2 tons of bombs to targets 2,400 kilometers inside enemy territory at 362 kilometers per hour. It would enable the Luftwaffe to reach Allied convoys in the Atlantic and Soviet installations beyond the Ural Mountains once the war broke out. The HE-177 was equipped with 3 cockpit-controlled remote MG-131 machine gun turrets, with only 1 manned emplacement in the tail for defense against flanking maneuvers. It was powered by 4 engines with only 2 propellers. 2 Daimler-Benz DB601 B12 engines were coupled together to drive a single propeller. They were grouped together tightly and covered in a cowling that made them run hot. The twin engines had a central exhaust system that exacerbated overheating and ignited any oil or grease that seeped from the motors. Hitler himself talked about the Heinkel He-177 bomber in a meeting with his military staff on February 1st, 1943. Speaking to Generaloberst Hans Jesernik, chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, he said, quote, "I have to say, again and again, I consider the whole 177 model a mistake, because it was demonstrated already during the Great War that the problem of installing two engines on one shaft is extremely difficult to solve and has led to constant difficulties. Another obvious problem for the He-177 was its size, making it an easy target from the ground. Its massive payload and range also meant that it already consumed fuel very fast. Heinkel adding weight to strengthen the overall structure for diving made the fuel performance even worse." Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring told the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after the war that, quote, "I had to ground that aircraft because it consumed too much gasoline. We just didn't have enough of it." Refusing to give up on the model, engineers kept redesigning the He-177. They introduced newer versions of the bomber, which were then modified further in the field. But none of the changes could overcome the inherent faults in the He-177. One such problem they could never figure out was how to keep the plane from swerving sharply sideways on takeoff. In The Rise and Fall of the Luftwaffe, author David Irving wrote that Göring always complained about how useless he considered the requirement for dive bombing capability on a heavy bomber. He said on one occasion Göring reportedly said, quote, "It is straightforward idiocy to ask of a four-engine bomber that it should dive. Had I been told of this for one moment, I should have exclaimed at once, what kind of nonsense is that? Now we're stuck with it." The He-177 V1 prototype had its initial flight on November 9, 1939, flown by Lieutenant Karl Franke. The flight ended after just 12 minutes because of overheating engines. Franke spoke favorably about the bomber's general handling characteristics, but complained of vibration in the propeller shafts, inadequate tail surfaces, and flutter that accompanied any vigorous movement of the elevators. In 1942, Luftwaffe Air Inspector Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch and Armaments Minister Albert Speer visited an airbase to check in on the project. While there, they had the opportunity to witness an He-177 with full bomb load take off. After it flew from sight, the plane banked steeply and side-slipped into the ground from 150 meters, killing everyone aboard. Milch said, quote, "What use is the best aircraft in the world if it can't stop falling apart?" By the time the He-177 proved useful, there were other developments, such as the creation of the German Luft-7 bomb sight, which was finally accurate from heights of 4,000 meters, rendering dive bombing unnecessary. However, the He-177 still saw limited service in the Western and Eastern fronts, as nearly 1,500 of them had been built. On one occasion, Göring watched 14 aircraft taxi out for late war attacks on London. 13 took off. 8 returned immediately with overheating engines. 1 diverted, and 4 reached London, but 1 was shot down. Those that made it accurately delivered their payloads, diving towards the objective, and then reaching the safety of the skies above 7,000 meters to avoid enemy fire. All bombers that actually made the trip came back unscathed. The mission demonstrated a potential survival rate higher than any other bomber aircraft at the time. Fast-diving heavy bombers could avoid defensive fire. Still, lamentably, the tactic was never evaluated at scale to gauge the plane's overall performance. Eric Brown, a British pilot who flew an He-177 that was captured in September 1944, said, quote, "Somehow the He-177 always conveyed an impression of fragility despite its size. It was one of the very few German aircraft of the period that I tested that I did not enjoy flying." During the siege of Stalingrad, the He-177 was used for evacuating wounded soldiers and delivering supplies. Still, after fuel consumption became a problem, the plane was discharged from further service. as the Reich could not afford to waste unnecessary fuel. In October 1944, the He-177 stopped production. Months later, Germany's ruin was complete. Perhaps the Luftwaffe could have fought longer and harder, and with better aircraft, had it not been so seduced by dive bombing. The Luftwaffe learned their lesson too late. Over-investing resources in a bad design can ruin an entire air force. Historians have speculated that the resources would have been better used for developing more fighter planes capable of protecting German cities. The Sikorsky S-72 was more than just a visually striking aircraft. This unique and unusual vehicle could take off and land vertically like a chopper, but it could also fly fast and far like a plane. The S-72 would ultimately be neither a helicopter nor a plane. Instead, it was a new concept, an X-Wing, conceived through a joint effort between the US Navy and NASA. Unfortunately, its innovative design ultimately proved too much for the time. The X-Wing was a concept designed to combine the vertical takeoff and hovering capabilities of a helicopter with the speed potential of a fixed-wing aircraft. It used a large four-bladed stiff rotor system that could be stopped mid-flight to turn into an X-shaped wing. In theory, the X-Wing was supposed to break away from the vertical takeoff and landing trend of early 1970s experimental aircraft, in which achieving a higher flight speed required extremely high rotor loadings, as still seen today in aircraft such as the V-22 Osprey. The X-Wing could instead achieve fixed-wing-only flight in the air by locking its rotor without the need for an additional wing. This meant a lower weight and more efficient design over other aircraft that needed both the rotor system and a separate wing. It also meant less powerful engines could be used. With its low hovering disc loading and the power to fly at high subsonic speeds, the X-Wing aircraft could both hover and fly a good portion of the flight envelope on only one of its two engines. This innovative concept was based on Professor Ian Cheeseman's work. Based at the University of Southampton, England, Dr. Cheeseman employed the Coanda effect to create and subsequently accentuate the lift on a cylindrical rotor blade. The Coanda principle states the tendency of a fluid jet to stay attached to a convex surface. When sufficient air is blown tangentially over a surface, the fluid will adhere and follow it until the curvature gets too big and detaches. If you've ever seen a ping-pong ball spinning on a jet of air, that is the Coanda effect. The same principle has been utilized to create helicopter designs without tail rotors. Dr. Cheeseman believed that if designed to take advantage of the effect, the X-Wing's rotor could be powered up only for takeoff and landing, and then be locked in mid-flight to be used as a wing. To give the rotor blades the correct shape for vertical takeoff and landing, compressed air would be vented out of the edge's surface and controlled by a computer. In the early 1970s, U.S. Navy engineers at the David W. Taylor Naval Ship Research and Development Center decided to work on Professor Cheeseman's idea of lift control. They were joined by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and the development of a hybrid vehicle began. Known as the NASA Army Rotor Systems Research Aircraft, or the RSRA, the vehicle would be equipped with an advanced X-Wing rotor system. The researchers were reluctant to commit the system to a prototype or to a concrete helicopter production program. Ideally, the project would first fully explore the flight performance of the rotor. Before developing the program, novelty rotor configurations could only be tested either on a stationary whirl stand or in a full-scale wind tunnel, such as the one found in NASA's Langley Research Center. Because of these test limitations, there was a high risk associated with actually deploying the concept in flight. The first stages of the RSRA began as an investigation on how to increase the speed, overall performance, reliability, and safety of a rotor aircraft. The The program also sought to reduce the noise, vibration, and maintenance cost of such aircraft. To achieve this, NASA and the Army concluded that a test aircraft dedicated to safely exploring all those boundaries would be worth developing. In the summer of 1971, NASA and the Army put out a request for proposal for a rotor test vehicle pre-design study. Sikorsky Aircraft and Bell Aircraft responded, and both were awarded 9-month study contracts. In July 1972, Sikorsky reported back to NASA and the Army with positive results on their pre-design study. They became the RSRA's primary developer. Since NASA wanted to keep program costs as cheap as possible, the use of existing aircraft and its components was highly encouraged. The end product included the Sikorsky S-67 helicopter base framework, paired with the Sikorsky's S-61 central rotor. The X-Wing was the most challenging concept Sikorsky aircraft ever worked on since it started operations in 1923. They named the aircraft the S-72. It would be a high-risk but high-payoff program. If technical challenges were overcome, and the full aircraft's correct achievement was achieved, Sikorsky would become a significant pioneer in state-of-the-art technology. Sikorsky established 2 different engineering teams. The first focused on developing the X-Wing rotor and wing systems, and how they would be applied to an aircraft. The second team concentrated on how to test these innovative and intricate systems on the RSRA. A lot of detailed work and collaboration was required from both teams. The aircraft's rotor blades needed to lift without centrifugal force or blade stiffening like other conventional helicopters. They would also have to be made from a stiff and durable double-ended material, since 2 of the blades would act as forward-swept wings in a stopped rotor flight mode. The Coanda effect was used to control the blade's lift. The engineers at Sikorsky replaced the mechanical swash plate used in conventional helicopters with a valving system in the pneumatic lines feeding continuous air to the rotor blades. The starting and stopping sequence of the X-Wing required complex, high-frequency manipulation of the circulation control valving system. This required the most advanced computer technology at the time to manage the process. Other technical challenges were the inclusion of a large compressor to provide the circulation control air, as well as a high-energy clutch and a brake to start and stop the rotor mid-flight. The S-72 had a total length of 70.6 feet and a height of 14.5 feet. Its empty weight was 21,700 pounds, and the maximum takeoff weight allowed was 26,050 pounds. A low-set, straight monoplane wing with a wingspan of 62 feet was installed under the S-72, while the base model tail rotor was retained. The S-72 was powered by a pair of General Electric T-58 GE5 turboshaft engines with 1,400 horsepower each. The turbofan installations were 2 General Electric TF-34 GE400A engines with a 9,400-pound thrust, situated along the fuselage sides. Performance specifications had a maximum speed of 350 miles per hour listed, and a cruise speed of up to 260 miles per hour. The original S-72 test frame could be operated either with or without the rotor unit. Due to the risk of flying such an experimental design, an equally unique ejection system was developed for the helicopter to increase the test pilot's survivability. The process involved complete destruction of the main rotor blades by explosives. Rockets would then eject the 3-man crew out of their positions and away from the fuselage. Only 2 of the aircraft were completed for training. The entire X-Wing system was built at Sikorsky's Florida facilities. The company's founder, Igor Sikorsky, had spent his early career years building fixed-wing aircraft, including the large flying boats that had become famous in the 1930s. But a new Sikorsky-designed fixed-wing plane had not flown in nearly half a century. Testing of the model began in December 1985 in a propulsion system testbed at Sikorsky. In 1986, the S-72 was transported to NASA's Dryden Flight Test Research Facility at Edwards Air Force Base in California in a Super Guppy KC-97 cargo aircraft. The entire flight test program was envisioned as a progressive accumulation of all the aircraft's features that needed testing. After several taxi tests, the S-72 was flown without the actual X-wing blades. The blades were later reinstalled for a full system test. Other initial tests used dummy blades to examine the development of the experimental pneumodynamic system that shaped the blades with air from the compressor inlet to the blade root. Another notable completed test with the S-72 was the use of the central and tail rotor load measurement system to calculate the vertical drag of the airframe. With a focus on safety, the RSRA was designed to return to base in case of an emergency should the rotor blades be severed from the rotor head. This way it would fly like a fixed-wing airplane without the rotor. When this early test produced successful results, it was a day of celebration for the Sikorsky team. Initially, the plan was to next fly it with 2 rotor blades, then with 4 blades, all with the actual rotors stopped. By mid-1987, the S-72 advanced to where it flew with its complete rotor turning at full speed. And by the end of the year, Sikorsky scheduled a test in which the rotor would be stopped and started during mid-flight. Sadly, this never happened. In 1997, the US government had funding issues and more critical priorities. The S-72's design was visually striking and innovative, but not exactly practical due to its complex systems needed to bring all of its new technologies together. The contract was eliminated. At the time of its termination, the government reviewed the program's costs and risks against the X-wing concept's potential. It was decided it would be in the best interest to terminate the program entirely. The program fell apart for the same reasons that shut down many other military and research programs. It was simply too expensive and technologically ambitious for its time. Although the Sikorsky S-72 flew several times, it always did so in either a full helicopter configuration or a full turbofan mode without the rotor blade. It never reached 350 miles per hour. Over the 5 years of the NASA Sikorsky contract, most of the aircraft's engineering team had resolved its many technical and physics challenges, such as the compressor and clutch development, software, composite material development, blade and rotor head fabrication. Several appropriate risk mitigation tests were accomplished in only a few short years. After the X-wing program, Sikorsky gained extensive technical experience, which significantly advanced technologies for future aircraft. Simply put, at the time of the contract's termination, the X-wing technology was still in its early development. The true potential of the concept could not be fully demonstrated. The Vought F-7U Cutlass carrier-based jet fighter was one of the most unusual designs ever produced for the US Navy. Created as Vought's entry into a 1945 day fighter design competition, it was partially based on aerodynamic data from German companies responsible for World War II's Nazi aircraft. Vought designers denied the German link at the time. When the revolutionary Cutlass first came into the US Navy service in April 1954, the swept-wing jet fighter represented a leap into the future. It was also the perfect candidate to carry the fighter-bomber torch into the Cold War era. But several technical and handling problems plagued it from the beginning, and over 1/4 of built jets were destroyed in several accidents. One of those problems? It didn't have a tail. At the dawn of the jet age, a period in aviation history that brought some of the best turbine-powered aircraft to the forefront, the Navy issued a request for proposal for a carrier-based fighter capable of operating at 40,000 feet and reaching Mach 1 speed. Before the request was made in June of 1945, aviation company Vought had already begun working on such a project. Their reputation preceded them, as they were the first company to develop a carrier-capable aircraft. They also had a trick up their sleeve. His name was Waldemar Voigt. Voigt was a former senior designer for Messerschmitt AG, the German aircraft manufacturing company responsible for many of the Nazi fighter aircraft that terrorized the Pacific and European theaters during World War II. In the 1940s, the German aircraft industry had built up an impressive technical background of swept-wing design aircraft. At Messerschmitt AG, Voigt oversaw several experimental aircraft projects for the Luftwaffe, the German aerial warfare branch. He also developed the Messerschmitt P-1110 and P-1112 projects involving designs for a single-seat high-altitude interceptor and a fighter powered by turbojet technology. After the war ended, Voigt moved to America to work with Vought. He supervised the development of new aircraft inspired by his knowledge of German swept-wing designs. Vought chose Rex Beazle to be the lead designer on the new project. Beazle was responsible for inventing the TS-1, the Navy's first aircraft built specifically for carrier operations, and the famed F-4U Corsair. This project would become his last before his retirement. The result was the Vought F-7U Cutlass. The jet had swept wings and twin wing-mounted tail fins on either side of a short fuselage, with a forward-placed cockpit to provide better visibility during carrier landings. From a technical standpoint, it had no tail. The Cutlass had an avant-garde nose landing gear strut that lifted the pilot's seat 14 feet into the air. Tailerons for pitch and roll control were installed, and its controls were powered by hydraulics. The system provided artificial feedback so the pilot could feel aerodynamic forces acting on the plane. The jet was capable of loading two 2,000-pound bombs on its inner pylons. It could also carry 4 AAM-N2 Sparrow air-to-air missiles and was fortified with 4 20mm cannons. When the Navy announced the request for proposals winner, the prototype's number changed from V346 to Vought F-7U. The Cutlass logged its maiden flight on September 29, 1948. It was piloted by Vought's chief test pilot, J. Robert Baker. The jet took off from Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland, reaching a maximum speed of 625 miles per hour. Further test flights went exceedingly well. When the tests proved that further prototypes of the F-7U would meet all Navy requirements, an order for 14 models was placed. Officials were convinced that the Vought F-7U Cutlass could be a viable threat in air-to-air combat. As soon as production on the Cutlass began, the Navy requested that it needed more powerful engines. Because of development problems with its power plant, the jet's second prototype never saw the light of day. After adjustments, the third model became the definitive production version. Equipped with Westinghouse J-46WE-8B turbojets, 288 jets were built and sent to 13 U.S. Navy squadrons. The Cutlass was touted as highly versatile in tactical functionality, but its performance underwhelmed from the beginning. Its turbojet lacked enough engine thrust, so its carrier takeoff and landing yielded disastrous results. The jet was also known to flame out on rainy days, another cause of concern. Fighter Squadron 81 was the first fleet to receive Cutlass models in April 1954. Strike Fighter Squadrons 81, 83, 116, 124, 151, and 212 also made deployments with the jet, but most of the models were beached ashore due to operating difficulties. Accidents quickly began to pile up. The Cutlass began receiving damning criticism and given nicknames such as Widowmaker, Ensign Eliminator, or Gutless Cutlass. Its most shocking incident happened to be caught on camera. On July 14, 1955, Fighter Squadron 124, aboard carrier USS Hancock, was performing flight operations with several models in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. When pilot Lieutenant Commander J. Alkire approached the carrier's deck, he could not gain enough thrust to clear the round down at the end of the flight deck landing area. The F-7U struck the side of the ramp, and as it slid left of the center lane, it burst into a ball of flames. Rumors circulated about several deck crew members' casualties, but the ship's logs only mentioned Commander Alkire. After another similar accident took the life of pilot Lieutenant George Millard, in which his nose gear and thrust malfunctioned, triggering his ejection seat, the USS Hancock's captain ordered every Cutlass to be taken off the ship. The elite Navy Flight Demonstration Squadron, the Blue Angels, flew 2 F-7U Cutlass jets as part of a side demonstration during the 1953 season. Both pilots and ground crews found the aircraft difficult to manage. Some of the issues the Blue Angels employees reported were landing gear and hydraulic system failures and engine fires while airborne. During the season's opening appearance, pilot Lieutenant Edward Whitey Freightner, formerly employed as the F-7U program manager, lost all hydraulic systems during a full afterburner takeoff and steep climb. Freightner tried to reach enough altitude for a safe ejection, and the jet's backup system eventually turned on. While making the emergency landing, he cut through trees on the end of the runway, which caused the left engine to burst into flames. With hydraulic fluid dripping from the side, Freightner made a hard turn and got the plane back on track. The crowd went wild. Before the Blue Angels called, Freightner knew that the Cutlass was trouble. As he told Air and Space magazine in 2012, quote, "We determined right off the bat that the Cutlass wasn't the answer. But the Navy wanted to get some time on it. I actually took it aboard ship and made 14 landings before the airplane broke in half right behind the cockpit during a landing." In a strange turn of events, a Vought F-7U Cutlass was the first aircraft to land on a new runway at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. While traveling to a show at Glenview Air Station in Chicago, Blue Angels pilot Lieutenant Hardin McKnight was flying a Cutlass when he experienced an engine flameout. Thankfully, Lieutenant Freightner was his co-pilot, and he was no stranger to Cutlass difficulties. Forced to make an emergency landing at the nearest runway, Freightner was redirected to Chicago's former Orchard Air Park, recently expanded and renamed O'Hare Airport. The runway had just been finalized and was temporarily covered in peach baskets in a makeshift solution to prevent aircraft from landing. Freightner and McKnight were instructed to ignore the baskets and land on top of them. Following these incidents with the Blue Angels, the two Cutlass jets were deemed unsuitable for demonstration flying. When asked about the insistence of showcasing the aircraft, Freightner recalled, quote, "There were congressmen, senators, and we had a couple of pretty senior officers who wanted their airplane to be the Blue Angels airplane." The aircraft were flown to the Naval Air Station in Tennessee, where they became maintenance instructional airframes for the Naval Technical Training Center. Of all the designs that came out of the jet age, the F-7U appeared to hold the greatest potential for supersonic flight. Its swept-back wings and unusual look represented a leap into the future for jet-powered aircraft. But despite its twin engines and hydraulic system, the F-7U lacked enough thrust and was too bulky to break the sound barrier. While flying at 30,000 feet, the Cutlass only reached Mach 0.98 and 0.99 with its afterburners. It was expected that with the afterburners on and at a power dive position, the jet could match the speed of sound, but it was a moot point. As tensions rose during the Cold War in the early 1950s, every new American aircraft design was expected to accommodate novel nuclear weaponry. New carrier-based attack planes were now the primary candidates to add this capability. In 1957, Vought analyzed all major Cutlass incidents. There had been 78 reported accidents, accumulating 55,000 flight hours. With approximately a quarter of the models lost in these mishaps, the Vought F-7U Cutlass held the highest accident rate of all Navy swept-wing fighter aircraft. This appalling safety record was mostly the result of advanced design techniques created to apply new aerodynamic principles with insufficiently reliable engines. On paper, the futuristic-looking Cutlass appeared to have all the necessary traits to make it the ideal fighter for the Cold War era. But with its poor carrier takeoff and landing performances and the many accidents in which it was involved, there was no point in continuing the program. The Vought F-7U Cutlass was retired from service in March 1959 and was replaced by a far more capable Vought fighter, the F-9F-8 Cougar, which went on to serve in the Navy for almost 20 years. On June 19, 1944, U.S. Navy and Imperial Japanese forces were engulfed in a series of brutal clashes where the smoke of battery salvos filled the ambiance, and the sky was the playground of carrier fighters. The First Battle of the Philippine Sea was raging on, and the combat zone was hot. Lieutenant Alex Versiu was flying a rugged but versatile Grumman F-6F Hellcat when he spotted an approaching formation of Japanese dive bombers that were bound for a carrier. Versiu did not hesitate and immediately intercepted the hostile formation at full speed, tearing them apart with the accurate fire of his Hellcat's 6 50 caliber machine guns. One by one, the bombers began to go down. In a span of just 8 minutes, the American pilot took them down with devastating effect. When Versiu landed for a refuel, he realized he had taken them down with only 360 rounds of ammunition, a true testament to what the Hellcat could do. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat carrier-based fighter was introduced to the U.S. Navy in December of 1940, 1 year before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Following its commission, Grumman began working on a successor. The Wildcat was considered a solid aircraft, but it was outperformed by the reliable Japanese Mitsubishi A-6M0, which could reach 331 miles per hour and was more agile for dogfights. This was more evident during the first months of the war in the Pacific, especially at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, where Navy pilots struggled to deliver decisive blows to the swift Mitsubishi Zeros. Grumman's F-6F Hellcat was considered an improved variant of the Wildcat, but it quickly evolved into its own platform. Meanwhile, the Navy intended to replace the Wildcat with the Vought F-4U Corsair, but development was slowed by the crash of the only prototype. According to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, quote, as a precaution against possible delays in the Corsair reaching the fleet, in June 1941, the Navy asked Grumman to develop an improved version of the Wildcat. The Grumman X-F6F-1 prototype physically resembled the Wildcat, but required some internal and external upgrades. The most important was a more powerful engine to even the odds against Japanese aircraft. To be able to use a more considerable power plant, the prototype required a larger propeller and consequently taller landing gear for additional ground clearance. All these performance and weight additions required a larger wing area, among other changes. The preliminary details essentially made the model a new aircraft that would retain some of the features of its predecessor, but would innovate in many others. After going back to the drawing board, Grumman co-founder Leroy Grumman and his team of engineers incorporated the ideas shared by veteran pilots and the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics. In the aftermath of the Battle of Midway, Grumman engineer Jake Swerble went to Hawaii to hear the suggestions that Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch had in mind to develop an American fighter that could overpower the Zero. Thatch was a Wildcat ace who'd come up with the Thatch Weave defensive maneuver when engaging hostile aircraft over the Pacific. Additional suggestions were given by another ace, Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare, who toured the Grumman facility in April of 1942. One of the main modifications that made the Hellcat different from the Wildcat was the location of the cockpit, which was placed higher in the fuselage to provide additional visibility for the pilot. As a result, the forward section of the fuselage was sloped down to the engine cowling. The Hellcat also replaced the hand-cranked main landing gear of the Wildcat with hydraulically actuated landing gear struts, and its wings were mounted lower in the fuselage and could be hydraulically folded. These wings followed Grumman's patented stow-wing design. Folding the carrier-based aircraft was critical, as the Hellcat would become the fighter with the largest wings of World War II, with a total wing area of 334 square feet. Although the Hellcat bore a familiar resemblance to the Wildcat, it was significantly heavier and larger. It had a length of 34 feet, a height of 13 feet, and a maximum takeoff weight of 15,415 pounds. Grumman chief engineer William Schwendler followed the simplistic and rugged style of Grumman aircraft and built the components of the Hellcat with twice the strength required in the specifications. The result was a tough, resilient fighter that was easy to produce and manufacture. The first Hellcat took to the skies in June of 1942 with a 1,600 horsepower Wright R2600 Cyclone engine. As expected, test pilots praised the aircraft, which achieved a maximum speed of 391 miles per hour and had an approximate combat range of 945 miles. Also, its service ceiling was over 37,000 feet, with an outstanding rate of climb of 2,600 feet. Grumman was so confident in the design that production started in October of 1942, while the prototype was still undergoing additional testing with its armament. The bold move earned Grumman a Navy production contract in January of 1943. Although the company struggled to grow its facility to produce more aircraft in less time, it unquestionably delivered. The model's main armament comprised 6 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun fitted in the wing's outer sections. Furthermore, the aircraft could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs to attack Japanese ships or ground troops entrenched deep inside the Pacific Islands. The Hellcat saw action for the first time in early September of 1943, when several fighters from USS Independence took down the Japanese Emily flying boat aircraft. In November of 1943, several Hellcats flew over the island of Tarawa to support the U.S. Marines. During the battle, the Hellcats claimed over 30 Zero shootdowns at the cost of just one of their own. Days later, several other Hellcats and Corsairs engaged Japanese fighters near Rabaul, New Britain, and took down over 50 aircraft with minimal casualties. The time of the Hellcat had come, and the Pacific was its new playground. The Hellcat quickly became the default aircraft of the U.S. Navy and the Marines. On December 4, 1943, an intense series of dogfights broke out between 90 Hellcats and over 50 A-6M-Zeros. In the aftermath of the aerial battle, the Hellcats emerged victorious, claiming 28 Japanese Zeros and losing only 3 of their own. Other similar series of aerial fights showed the Hellcat was superior to the Zero in most aspects, except for the Zero's impressive turning ability at slower speeds. Also, the 6 50-caliber guns of the Hellcat were no match for the lightly armored Zeros, which were made for swift attacks and not long dogfights against heavier fighters. The Japanese would eventually even the odds with the Kawanishi N1K George, but the Hellcat was so effective that it would not be modified until the last stages of the war. The F-6F-5 variant featured additional armor for the cockpit and fuselage, an improved R2800-10W engine, and spring tabs on the ailerons to bolster maneuverability. Grumman also introduced Hellcats fit for night and reconnaissance operations. These were standard Hellcats, equipped with the AN/APS-4 radar mounted behind the right wing, and additional radar controls in the control panel. Armament-wise, This variant could also fire rockets to complement its bomb load. And some night fighters were also equipped with 2 M2 cannons, or a mix of one 20mm cannon and 2 50-caliber machine guns. Although the Grumman F-6F Hellcat made quite a reputation in the Pacific against the Japanese Empire, it also fought over the skies of Europe and the Mediterranean. The British Royal Navy received over 1,250 Hellcats as part of the Lend-Lease Act, and they renamed the aircraft the Grumman Gannet and later Marlet. The aircraft were deployed in 1944 and saw action off the coast of Norway, the Mediterranean, and the Far East, where some units joined the fight against the Japanese. Then, in April of 1944, a unit of Royal Navy Marlets attacked the battleship Tirpitz at Kafjord in Norway. Although they did not deliver the blow that sealed the fate of the Kriegsmarine ship, they were crucial for the operation. The Marlets also took part in Operation Overlord in June of 1944, and the subsequent Allied invasion of southern France in September of that year. The Marlets faced several Heinkel bombers, ME-109s and BF-109s, always showing impressive performance. Between June of 1942 and November of 1945, Grumman manufactured over 12,275 Hellcats from Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage on New York's Long Island. It was the largest number of aircraft ever produced at a single facility. When the war ended, the Hellcat was replaced by the F-8F Bearcat, but was still used for second-line duties. Some became target drones, while others were packed with explosives and used to blow up bridges in the Korean War. The Hellcat also became the first aircraft used by the Navy's Blue Angels demonstration squadron. Ultimately, the rugged aircraft was credited with destroying over 5,200 aircraft while in service with the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and the Royal Navy. And of the 6,477 aerial victories claimed by Navy pilots during World War II, an impressive 4,947 were attributed to F-6F Hellcat pilots.